What is going on, everyone? So it is time for my composition review video from my fall of 2021 visit to Zion National Park. And typically I record these videos not long after coming back from the trip. But after the fall trip, I had all the box sets to produce, and after a while I realized I forgot to do one of these videos. So we're gonna take a look at my favorite images from that trip. I'm gonna go through the various compositions, talk about what was going through my mind, and share my thoughts on those images. So we'll start with this one right here, which was one of my favorite images from the trip. This was an area where there was this grassy meadow with these long grasses, and in the probably week or so before heading to Zion, there was a unusual early fall snowfall, and it was enough to weigh down the grasses and really create this very fascinating texture within the grass. And it was a relatively small meadow, but I walked around the whole meadow using my artist view catcher, which is this little plastic window with a rectangular cutout, and you can just look through it and try to find a composition. And most of the meadow was complete madness. But when I reached this area, it was very interesting because there was a diagonal flow to the grass. And what really captivated me was this lower corner right here and how this swept in from the corner. I'm not talking from the actual corner, because as I mentioned in my Death Valley composition review, I try to avoid having things come in from a direct corner. I'd say here it's kind of more so from about here where this flow comes in. But I loved how it branched off and kind of worked its way through, branching off as it goes, eventually leading up over here. So you have this flow through the image like this, and it is pure madness, but I was able to find a particular place to stand in order to give some degree of order to the madness of this meadow. And I was very, very happy with how this one turned out. And just this really cool branching flow to it. And I've found many other areas that have long grass like this, but for whatever reason, I was able to find a rhythm to this one. And typically, some degree of a diagonal flow makes for a very good composition because it makes it rather dynamic. So I was very happy with the way that this one turned out. This was taken with a 240mm lens, which is equivalent to maybe about a 28mm or so on a full frame. So a moderate wide angle. And fairly similar to what the default camera on the iPhone will show. Next up, this is a scene that I've hiked past countless times through the years, and I always was trying to find a way to photograph it, and I'm not quite sure why it was this particular time in particular that I finally figured it out. Because anytime there's a beautiful sandstone wall with trees up against it with really nice reflected light, I know that there's gonna be potential there. And I'm always attracted to odd numbers when it comes to composition. So the fact that there's 3 trees works out really well. There's no true vertical references within this composition. All these trees are leaning, the wall is leaning, which makes it a little bit easier. And I know that sometimes people get a little bit techie when it comes to large format cameras and wanting to have perfect perspective correction and this and that. But for a scene like this, that really doesn't matter because everything is leaning and that adds to the character of the scene. But what really attracted me to this particular scene, in addition to the trees and the walls, was grounding the photo with the maples at the base. And I wanted to make sure that the trees emerged from the maples. So you can see here there's some green in front of it, and in this case you have a little bit of those rusty leaves in front of it. The previous year, this maple here turned brilliant red, which was very distracting. And also the year before that, it was a brilliant red shade as well. So this year I was quite pleased to see that this one went more of a rusty orange. And it's pretty much the same color as the sandstone wall. Because if you can imagine, if this was this bright red tree right here, it would suck your eye right to this corner and it would become a bit of a visual conflict. But in this case, it blends in very nicely and it complements not only the color of the trunk here in reflected light, but the sandstone wall. And so I am quite pleased with this one. Once I figured out where to stand in terms of trying to balance the distance between these trees, this is a sort of scene where, you know, moving a foot or two to the right or left is going to start moving these trees in relation to each other. But once I figured out where to stand in order to give it the most breathing room between them that I could, then I started paying attention to the edges. And I knew I needed to chop off this branch over here, just so that it could extend outside the composition, extend into the imagination. Because something like this, I believe it was more or less abruptly ending just a little outside the composition. And if I were to show that, then it would become a bit of a source of conflict. And there's also some interesting lines that form. So you have this line here in the sandstone. You have the branches creating a similar line right here. And then you have all the lines based on the trees there. So it's a matter of being able to ground the trees within the base, show some greenery in front of them, and just trying to find the best place to stand in order to organize the chaos of the scene. And I'm quite pleased with how this one turned out, and it's quite the glow in that canyon. And for this particular photo, I returned to this scene several other times during the course of the trip, mostly just to enjoy the evening. And it was either cloudy or windy, which kills the light. And then eventually these leaves right here had fallen off. So my window early in the trip was quite good for that. This is a scene I photographed fairly early in the trip. And it is at the base of a slope, and there's a relatively large Ponderosa Pine growing on that slope. So the pine cones, they fall off and they gather at the base of the slope. And it really created a very interesting texture and pattern with all the light colored bits of the pine cones. And the day before, it was very windy. And so we have all of these pine needles that fell there. And I'm very much drawn to warm, cool color combos, because warm colors advance in the composition, cool colors tend to retreat in the composition. So even though we have a flat scene with rather even lighting, the fact that we have this warm, cool color combination, it helps to build more depth to the scene. This was photographed in subdued light. And there's a little bit of reflected light from the left, but most of the light is coming from the blue sky overhead. And this went a little bit cool for the color, but that's actually something I was hoping for, because that is what helps to build the depth in the scene. This is an example of just photographing chaos. And there's something about it when you photograph a completely chaotic scene with no defined subject. There's not like one dominant pine cone, or there's not one dominant thing within this composition. But there's something about the chaos that builds a sense of calm because of the repetition of pattern, repetition of shape. And so it would have been very easy to simply walk past a scene like this. But in this case, I knew that there was something there, and this is a photo I really do enjoy from that trip. It'll be a little tricky to print just because there's a lot of dark tone, and to make it have this same sort of appearance on paper will be a little bit tricky. But I'm definitely quite happy with how that one turned out there. All right, next up. These two pine trees are ones I'd had an eye on for a while. And I was always trying to figure out how to photograph them. And initially, my struggle was that I was trying to photograph the entire tree. And that became a little bit of an issue, because even though, yes, I would be able to photograph all the way up to the very top of the tree, showing the entire tree really wasn't great from an aesthetic standpoint. It felt a little bit awkward. For me, with these trees, the part I really enjoy the most are these branches and the look of these pine needles set against that light colored sandstone. I had the opportunity to stand in front of these trees again only about a week ago when I was passing through here on the way back from my spring trip. And it was interesting because now I'm accustomed to this composition I photographed here. But when I looked at the trees, I was actually surprised to see that they were growing parallel to each other, and they were nice and perfectly straight up and down. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, when it comes to shooting large format, sometimes people have a tendency to get really technical with it. They want to have the perspective correction all the time. They want to make sure that the verticals are purely, true to form and everything. And that's great for architecture. That's absolutely necessary for architecture. But when you're photographing a subject like this, the fact that I am angling the camera upward creates some perspective distortion, which causes those trees to lean into each other, which I think adds to the story of the scene. Because now you have the larger tree, the smaller tree, they're angled towards each other. They pretty much become one up top here, yet they have their own identities down below with a different look to the bark on either of those trees. So in this case, the perspective distortion really helps to add to the story of the scene in a way that if I had photographed them from a technically perfect standpoint, I think the image would have been a little bit dry. And I know that sometimes with large format, people get a little intimidated at first, thinking that they have to do all these sort of movements in order to create these technically proficient images. But when it comes down to it, it's really about the feeling you get from the image. And more often than not, I find that using a little bit of that perspective distortion helps to pull you into the scene. This was photographed in subdued light. There was the sun was now behind this formation of sandstone, and it was illuminating the hillsides behind me, which is sending some nice soft light into the scene, which helps to build the contrast of the branches up against there. And I did make sure I had enough room down below here to ground the composition. I always find that having a little bit more foreground than you think you need is a good decision. And this bright spot right here, if I was at just standing height, this would have been a really bright distraction, but I got my camera down really low to the ground. And by doing that, these bushes here crept higher and helped to cover a bit of that spot. But also by having my camera lower to the ground, I enhanced the perspective distortion, which brought those trees a little closer together. But I'm quite happy with this from a storytelling standpoint. The two trees, they become one, yet they have their own separate identity down below. And I was paying close attention to the amount of space right here and here. You'll note that there is a little bit less space here than here. And the reason for that, typically I go for a fairly balanced composition. But in this case, there is a bias where it leans in a little bit this way. So it gives a little bit more breathing room over here. But beyond that, I was just being mindful of where I'm chopping branches up top there. But I think this right here is the most important branches on this tree. But I'm certainly quite happy with the way that one turned out. And sometimes to photograph a scene, the best thing is to photograph just part of it, not the whole thing. Next up, this is one of the final photos I shot on the trip. And these beautiful maples, they grow along the banks of some of the washes in Zion. So they like the steep slopes, the loose soil. And when walking along them, these branches here have always stood out to me, but I've always had a hard time photographing them because oftentimes you'll have these branches set against absolute pure, pristine, full maples, and it just doesn't quite work right for one reason or another. But in this particular area, I was able to climb a sandstone slope on the other side of the wash, and I can shoot across the wash, now looking directly across at it as opposed to trying to look up and having some awkward angles with the sky. I love the angle of this right here. I love this swoop. And while setting up the composition, I also realized the importance of this branch. So this branch, which is arcing out of the composition versus this one, which is staying in the composition, they are playing off each other. This adds tension to the composition that helps with this right here. This branch is going to mimic the shape of this one. And then I also liked how we have these branches coming in here at a similar angle. And you get a little bit of a flow within the composition, kind of a swirling sort of thing where everything gets crammed within this composition. But then this one branch right here is going to go opposite of everything else. And without that, yes, the composition could still work, but I think this adds just enough of the opposing motion to the composition to help give just that necessary bit of tension that really helps with everything else. This is also a scene where, looking at this now, I honestly wouldn't mind having a little bit more here, just like a little bit more space on all sides. But I also know that when I had revisited this during my winter trip, I looked at the scene and realized that things pretty much abruptly end outside this composition anyways. So I was able to, I think, do the best that I could. Even though I feel like I wish I had a little bit more room there, I think I did the best I could with this composition. And one of the things I've mentioned in the past is that composition is very much a visual negotiation. So you have all these chaotic and random elements, and you're just trying to find the best possible solution to give some degree of order to the madness. It's not always going to be a perfect composition. It's not always going to be a perfect solution, but you're just trying to find the best that you can do for that scene. And having some degree of imperfection within that composition is what makes that image a lot more relatable, what makes it feel a bit more real. Because we'll see those images sometimes where it's absolutely perfect in terms of the subject, the composition, everything else within the frame. And something about it just, it doesn't look real, it doesn't look relatable, and it seems to lose some degree of story. So in this case, maybe having a little bit less around the edges than I would like, perhaps that adds a little bit more visual tension to the scene, which helps everything else. And maybe the photo wouldn't work as well if I did show a bit more. And finally, this is also one of my favorite images from my fall trip to Zion. And this was a very interesting scene. This was my second attempt to photograph this particular grove of trees, though my first attempt was actually photographing over here, because we have this group of trees here, there's another group of dead trees here, and I had this pine tree within the middle of the composition. But it was a little too chaotic, it just didn't quite work. And when I returned to the scene, I found that there was a very particular place I could stand that set this tree out from the backgrounds. So you have some nice spacing between this tree and those trees. And what's not very apparent when just looking at this composition right now is how much in the foreground this tree is compared to these ones. I mean, you can see that these trees are rooted back on this hillside, but this tree is not only not on that hillside, it's on the hillside leading towards me. So this one is quite a ways in front of those, and as a result, you have this parallax or perspective shift where if I move about, if I move my camera 3 inches to the right or left, you're going to find that this tree is going to creep very close to that one or that one. So this is definitely the sort of scene where you need to be standing in a very particular place in order to have all the elements align just right. And this is also a scene that I revisited when I stopped through Zion on the way back from my backpacking trip. And it was interesting looking at this scene again and realizing some of the decisions that I made at that point in time and how important they were to this composition. So what I noticed when I looked at this scene again just over a week ago was that this tree and this tree, they end almost immediately outside that composition. So this tree goes on maybe to about there and then it ends, and this tree ends maybe about right there. So I made a very deliberate choice of chopping off those trees because I wanted those trees to extend beyond the bounds of the composition so that in your mind they just keep going and going and going. Because can you imagine how this would be distracting if this tree ended right there, just like that? Your eye would be drawn to this area right here, and it would distract from everything else going on in that composition. And that's also the reason why I have the bookends of these trees right here. Because I wanted to make sure that since there's no getting rid of this tree, there's no getting rid of this tree, I really enjoyed how you have just a little bit of them peeking into the composition, just enough to visually contrast to these trees here that are dead, but also you create these dark boundaries on the edge of the composition, and your eye is going to be attracted to bright areas. And I was listening to something a while back, and it was Charles Kramer, who's a photographer. I absolutely enjoy his work. And he was giving a talk, and it may have possibly been for On Landscape, which is a fantastic publication out of the UK. I think that's maybe where it was from. But he was talking about how, yes, your eye is drawn to bright areas, but you check the dark areas first. And if you think about it, it is something that dates back to, I don't know, like the times when we were hunting and living in caves and such. You check the dark areas to look for threats, for predators, and then your eye is going to go towards the light areas. So that is one of the reasons why here you have the bright area, but you have the dark to light, which kind of creates that motion, because your eye might glance down here or here or here, but it's going to end up toward the middle of the composition. And I really want the emphasis to be right there on that middle tree, standing in just the right place to have that. I love the slope of the sandstone. It has a very calming feeling to it. And in addition to that, I liked how the color of the sandstone very much matches the color of the dead pine trees. And then when you add to that, some of the angles of some of these branches either are similar to the angles of the sandstone, or they are, running opposite of it. So it really has a very nice flow as a result of that. I wanted to have enough of this area here to ground the composition. So you see where these trees are rooted. There's no way for me to show the base of this tree, but that being said, it's fairly well visually rooted within this larger mass down here. There was one rather significant distraction to this, which I was able to burn down. And if you look at this tree trunk right here, I'm going to turn off a layer of correction. So you can see how this was one of the brightest things within that composition. And your eye is going to go right to this bright area, and it's going to neglect that tree. So I did a selection of just those bright areas, and I used a curves layer just to darken it down a little bit so it more matches the color of the other stuff. And you can see now with this toned down a little bit, now you're going to look at this tree. So here is the before, and then here is the after. Just a very subtle edit, which is enough to put more emphasis on this tree right here. So overall, it was a very productive fall. And I was quite happy to find the variety of subjects, and with this right here becoming one of my all-time favorite photos from Zion. And then this photo right here was a result of me exploring a new part of Zion that I hadn't had much of a chance to check out before. And the fall color was running a little bit late, which gave me an opportunity to check out some new areas, which is always a fun thing. But I hope this was helpful, and thank you so much for watching. We'll see you around next time.